Welcome to this month's episode of Echoes, a monthly series where we spotlight our community of contributors, the writers and artists who've been central to Art Paper's creative and rigorous coverage over the years. This month, we have a dialogue between Mia Imani Harrison and Nzinga Simmons. Both wrote reviews of Simone Leigh's work. In this conversation from 2022, Simmons and Imani Harrison share the prescient insights each received from Leigh's work, keying in on how profoundly important it was to experience Leigh's work in person, as well as the broader things we can all bring into our lives from Leigh's practice. The texts they're discussing are linked in the description. There's also a link if you'd like to support the work of Art Papers by making a donation or purchasing from our shop.
Yay!
And we made it. We made it. The Smoky Quartz is here. 2 Smoky Quartzes. We're keeping it grounded.
So excited. Oh my goodness. I was nervous. I'm like, I don't know why every time I type your name to invite you to the live, it's every Mia but you.
They just wouldn't let us live today, you know. And shouts to all the Mias. Mia was not always a common name. I was picked on for my name as a child, so I'm glad that there's a lot of Mias to choose from, and that we were able to get myself here. Yes.
So here, maybe we should wait for a few more minutes. I started the live and then stopped it to try and find. I'm like, maybe I'm spelling it wrong.
Teaser. It's the teaser. Well, you know, it's because at least when people try to find me, some people put Mia Harrison, which is my full, my government name. Mia Imani Harrison is my full name, but I go by Mia Imani and my artist name to actually honor both my father's and my mother's lineages. So maybe there was something with that, but either way, we're here. I'm just so happy to meet you. And you were just in Venice a little while back with TK, whom I just adore. I was so pissed that I missed that trip, but it's all good.
No, I'm like, when I got the email to do this conversation with you, I was in Venice and I was like, yes, absolutely. And then I read your review and I was like, wow, I mean, we'll talk about it later, but I just loved how deeply personal it was and how you sort of talked about generations of Black women and how going to the Venice is honoring them in certain ways. So it was just a beautiful review.
It's so funny too, because if you take it one step further, I just went to the Loophole of Retreat in Venice, so I just went to the conference. So how reading your work from the original, the foundation, to then going to the Biennale to witness the work, and we've both been able to do that, to then myself being able to witness what the world of the Loophole of Retreat looks like in a different way, right? 700 Black folks in Venice at the same time.
I'm like, I could not if they went out like that, but I tuned into the live a little bit and I was like, wow, this really is a testament to the power of the collective,
Absolutely. And I do recommend anyone who was not able to be there in the flesh to go check out the Loophole of Retreat online. I believe everything's still stored so you can get into the content of each day and bring tissues, because the amount of tears that I had, and was not, of course, you're in a space where you're surrounded, at least for myself, speaking for myself, I was surrounded by the folks of which I am part of their legacy, and so to see Tina Camp, to see Saidiya Hartman, to see Simone Leigh, to sit in front of them, that's already overwhelming. But then to recognize all the things that they've carried and the women before them have carried, and then thinking of all the things that I was also bringing there and releasing and cleansing too, it was wild. And I was just boo-hooing, ugly crying. We all were.
That we do.
We have to get into it. So yeah, I mean.
I guess we could kick this off. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Art Papers Contributors Conversation, which is a series of discussions between past and present Art Papers contributors. My name is Nzinga Simmons. I contributed to the 2019, which seems so long ago, Strategies of Response issue of Art Papers, which is just right here. And I contributed a review of Simone Leigh's Guggenheim exhibition, Loophole of Retreat. And I'm joined with Mia Imani Harrison, who wrote an incredible review of Simone Leigh's U.S. Pavilion for the Venice. Just as some housekeeping things before we start, if you're interested in purchasing either one of those issues, like in the flesh, you can go on artpapers.org and go to like the shop section, and it's really quick, easy. If you are not interested in spending, want to engage with the work, with both of our reviews, they're available for free online at artpapers.org. And if you're interested in just more conversations and fun events like this, you can subscribe to the weekly Art Papers newsletter, also on artpapers.org. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about my review of Simone Leigh's Guggenheim, and then sort of hand it over to you, Mia, to talk a little bit about your review, and then hopefully the iconographic similarities, divergencies, our experiences in Venice will spur just like a really incredible conversation. And lastly, hopefully the folks in the chat, if you have, oh, and Sarah says we're both featured on the homepage, so.
Hey.
And also, since we're on devices, if you go to Art Papers Instagram account and just do link in bio, there's like a really neat link tree of all of those things. So yeah, hopefully this is a really great conversation. And for the folks in the chat, if you have thoughts or if you have questions or comments about anything that me or Mia shares today, throw them in the chat, and at the end we'll spend the last, I don't know, does 15-20 minutes sound good to you? Just go for those comments. And yeah, so I guess to start, I want to talk a little bit about my review in Art Papers. I feel like fall 2019 seems so long ago. It was pre-pandemic. We didn't even know what pandemic was.
It was only a panini at that point. Like
at that point. And I think that in thinking about what I was focused on when writing my review, I really wanted to sort of think about how is Simone Leigh defining Black womanhood, and how is she sort of, describing Black womanhood through forms, through materiality, through structure, through all the formal qualities of her sculptures. But I think that one of the most telling ways that she describes an ontology of Black womanhood is like through the title itself, The Loophole of Retreat. And I guess for those of you who are unfamiliar, The Loophole of Retreat is drawn from a slave narrative by Harriet Jacobs, a 19th century slave narrative by Harriet Jacobs, where she sort of describes a period in her life after she escaped enslavement, and she hid for 7 years in a 3x3 crawl space. And so she describes this 3x3 crawl space as a loophole of retreat, and she sort of understands sort of like this metaphorical refuge from a life enslaved. And in that text, she talks about how she would rather exist in this loophole of retreat, this 3x3 crawl space, than go back to a life living enslaved. And I feel like there's something about that sort of describes this really defined autonomy. And it sort of, it makes us sort of think about, okay, how can we sort of understand an ontology of Black womanhood outside of, you know, this historical trauma, you know, outside of subjugation, outside of the other gaze, you know what I mean? And how can we sort of understand an ontology of Black womanhood through the autonomous actions that often follow that trauma? One of the works that I really loved from that exhibition was this work. It was like an installation and an object, and it was like it was this walled concrete enclosure, and right, it had this one singular pedestal of a sculpture, and on the sculpture it had these like braided forms that looked sort of like cornrows. But what really like stuck with me about that work is that there was this conglomeration of sounds happening behind, you know, in the background. So, you know, usually you go into museums, particularly like museums like the Guggenheim, and it's quiet, you know, people are sort of in silence viewing these artworks, but there was this like cacophonous sound throughout the gallery space, and the sound was referencing, Simone Leigh described the sound as sonic protection, and it was sort of this conglomeration of sounds that reference the story of Debbie Africa, who was an activist, but when she was actually in prison, she was pregnant and she gave birth to her baby. And for people who don't know, when you give birth to a baby in prison, they automatically take the baby if you don't in handcuffs, you know? So
Yeah.
um, after she gave birth to her baby, the guards didn't know. And so all of the inmates, the other women inmates, they were making all of these noises and sort of like creating this sonic distraction so that she can have a couple more hours or days with her baby. And so, again, there's this idea that the loophole of retreat, even if you're in this sort of subjugated or confined context, you can still find the space to have, to assert your autonomy. And I think that's that the idea of a loophole of retreat really sort of reverberates in the exhibition at Venice as well. And I don't know, I guess this is a good segue to sort of have you talk a little bit about your
Yes.
contribution. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I absolutely hear you in this notion of getting into what does an architecture of sovereignty look like outside of trauma, and what are the ways of which we as Black women can define our subjectivity in ways that are actually tied to our own geology, not geology. Actually, yes, in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, geography, geology. Like, how can we root it in root it and steep it in a Black reality, as opposed to trying to tie it to ways of modernism or other legacies that we've seen articulate subjecthood, right? And so, for me, when I was writing the piece, part of it was, okay, how do I want to approach this? You know, with arts writing, it could very much be just witnessing the thing, articulating the thing, calling people into the space. Because, like you mentioned with the Guggenheim, specifically around sound, right? Like, most gallery spaces are very quiet. Most gallery spaces kind of orchestrate how you move through the works, how you engage with the works, how you sit with the works or don't. And so, when I went to Venice, I was really interested in, okay, this is a historical moment, and the fact that the Milk of Dreams was featuring about 95% of female works. This is the first time we've ever seen that many female works in Venice displayed in that manner. It also had to deal with the gaze or under the umbrella of the Milk of Dreams, right? So what are the ways in which we imagine ourselves outside of the material realm, and the ways that we've been you know, um, isolated to colonial structures or systems of oppression or white supremacy or patriarchy, et cetera. And so, arriving, I was very much aware of all the things that needed to occur in order for me to even stand in front of the works. And I really wanted to write a piece that conjured all the people that could not make it, and also could create an accessibility and the use of language and the use of kind of, let's say I see the work as kind of giving a handout and saying, let's go together, join me on this journey.
Yeah.
And when I arrived, it was very much a sense of overwhelm and just extreme joy in seeing that something so monumental could be made by a Black woman at that time, right? Like, you're looking at 2019, when this is before we knew the world was messed up, but this is before we really all got into the fact of, yeah, this is just not working anymore and these systems are crumbling, right? And to then come into when I went in 2022 and really witnessing all the discourse that had to have happened to that time in order to allow it to be possible at that scale and that level. And so, like you said, getting into sovereignty, getting into objects that both historicize Black female subjectivity and subjecthood, but also extend beyond into both the metaphorical and the metaphysical, and looking at the spiritual nature of a lot of the works that she creates, and these portals or loopholes that are also made through material objects. So I was really interested in how might we extend some of these forms as a syllabus for understanding the ways of which we can have new agency as Black women and beyond.
Yeah.
How might we, embody some of these things? But I'll
Yeah.
hop back to you.
I was just gonna like jump off of that and say I was really interested in sort of like how you went into describing the exterior of the pavilion, and how sort of, again, like, how can we sort of understand this as through an alternative art historical lens, like how
Mhm.
you know, when we approach this building, we understand the history of the Venice Biennale, you know, and maybe if people who are watching like don't, you know, this is the first international art fair. This is inextricably tied to a legacy of colonialism. Like that, the first Venice Biennial was the spoils of colonialism on view, you know, of colonial powers, spoils of colonialism on view. So it's like, what does it mean for a Black woman, number one, to be in that context and to be making work for Black women? You know, I love when you wrote in your review, you said our Blackness, the plurality of Black existence, came through each of us who walked through Lee's Pavilion because it no longer belonged to the U.S. And you know, just this idea, like, you know, you can be curating for the Venice Biennial, but be making something that is so like that really challenges the colonial art historical view. You know what I mean? And like how is that done through material? You know, using the raffia and like covering the thatched roof. You know, it's like creating this alternative reality and like creating a world where like Black women are the center and we're not the margins, you know? Like
Absolutely.
yeah.
I think it's one of those things to call in the history because, like you said, to understand the colonial presence of just those pavilions in general, like this is a colonial project, countries are being named. It requires money to be present. And even to this day, there's notions of, you know, tension around who gets to show and who doesn't, right? Like I went to the Zimbabwean pavilion, which was on the side, you know, with a sign written by hand, basically saying we're over here and showcasing multiple artists. And I remember walking through, the guy was so sweet that was, you know, like holding the space. He was the doula of the work, right? And there's a French woman, a white French woman next to me. And the first thing she says to him is, this is too confusing. There's too many works in this space. Why isn't there just one artist? You know, this notion of, because I've been trained to occupy the space in a certain way and I've been trained to experience art in a certain way, I must see it in order for it to then be validated, right? And so, like Simone's work, it was not just her; she is bringing all of us in, physically, in the flesh of how the works manifest, and the fact that they are representations of Black women, Black subjecthood, the care and the labor Black women have done with their hands. That's why I keep talking with my hands, also because it's in Italy, and you know, they also do that. But this sense of, yeah, who is in the room and who do you make the work for? And I think it's so brilliant that Simone is very clear about saying this work is made for Black women. There's no question about it. You don't have to assume anything else. So like you said, if we start with that being the nucleus, that being the sun within that, you know, that universe, that galaxy, then how might we then think of the other offerings, right? Like she is the builder of worlds with her hands. So then how do we re-engage with that work? How do we extend some of the promises? How do we also look at some of the pitfalls, you know, that have made it to where this is the first time this has happened, right? And so I would love to hear kind of what you felt when you witnessed the pavilion in person, and also seeing some of the echoes of the Guggenheim folding into the US Pavilion.
Yeah, I think like no, first of all, it was my first time ever in Italy. So
Mm.
that was an experience in and of itself. Like, you know, going to a place where, and again, this is my first time in Italy, and I only went to Venice. And so yeah, just having that experience of being in a space where there's not many Black people walking around, like at all, you know, and walking up to the pavilion. And even honestly, even on the day that I went to, because you know that it's sort of separated, the Milk of Dreams on one site, and then the pavilion all in another site. So I did those days differently. I did those on 2 different days. But the day that I went and I walked around the pavilions, you know, there are all of these countries on view. But I'm like, all I see is white people, you know?
Yeah.
And beyond that, to your point about the sort of layout of the pavilions, it was really interesting which countries had like a built structure versus which countries had this sort of structure that it seemed very like transient or like temporal. You know what I mean? And like um, how does that sort of convey meaning, and how does that sort of impact our value being put on particular works of art? You know, you go up to, when I walked up to Simone Leigh's pavilion, or Simone Leigh's pavilion, the U.S. pavilion, pavilion.
Simone Leigh Pavilion, honestly.
You know, I even though I feel like I was one of few Black people that had seen that day, I felt like welcomed in, because that sculpture, and you mentioned it in your review, that sculpture is like a Dembe sculpture, and you know that sculpture has been like, those types of sculptures have been reproduced by diasporic Black people over and over and over again, to the point where like even walking up to it, even though it's in this monumental scale, and it's like it does sort of echo traditional art historic classical African sculpture in a certain way, it still like feels very familiar. And I had this conversation with TK actually after we left the pavilion, because we had a conversation of like, okay, so how do we understand these works, and how do we sort of interpret them and talk about them? Do we use sort of our historical lens and sort of lean into the formal qualities of the work? And because that alone is beautiful. Like there were certain objects that when I went through the pavilion, I could see how she layered on the glaze to make it look like it's dripping off the woman's hands, you know, things like that. That's the type of stuff that gets me off, you know. But like in conversation with TK, he's like, you know, I think a really important aspect of Simone Leigh's work is that there's multiple entry points. So you can understand it through the materiality. You can understand it through the sort of legacy of this sort of legacy of Black art making. But then you could also sort of just see it as, this is reminiscent of the tchotchkes on my, you know, grandmother's mantle, or like the raffia skirt is like reminiscent of this or of that, you know. And I think that's one thing that both of our reviews had in common, is that we sort of looked at the work from multiple entry points. There was the one jug in the Guggenheim. I talked about it in the cover, this Mississippi restaurant that the shapes mirror each other. They're these large Black women with this huge voluminous skirt, but in the Mammy's Cupboard restaurant in Mississippi, inside of her skirt there's like a little door, and you kind of walk through, and then that's the, you know, the interior of the restaurant. And so what does it mean for Simone Leigh's work to have a similar shape, but it's completely solid? There's eyes on it. You're not about to go up in one of her sculptures in that same way, you know. I think one thing that also struck me going through the pavilion is that the iconographic shifts. You know, now she's creating the eyes in the sculpture, whereas before all of the work the eyes were missing, and I you know, I sort of understood that as her rejecting a gaze and sort of, you know, allowing the objects to have a certain agency that doesn't need to sort of reciprocate the gaze of onlookers. And I think that shifted in the work in the pavilion. There was the first sculpture that was actually based off of, you know, an actual person, and video was accompanied by it. And I don't know, I just, what were your thoughts?
It's funny because I think it's Sharifa, right? That is the sculpture that's made about a person. And I think Simone Leigh actually posted either today or the other day of Sharifa actually standing in front of the piece. And so what does it mean to use a Black female body as a blueprint for a sculpture or for a monument that serves as architecture? And that person to then witness themselves as an object at a completely different scale than how they might imagine themselves, you know, larger than life or at this colossal level. And so, yeah, I did think, I was like, oh, this was made to honor a Black woman who Simone has a relationship with, whom Simone is in community with, right? And thinking about the ways of which I honor the people that I love and bring them with me and carry them with me, and how that also deviates from the traditional ways monuments have been used to honor people, right? Like, this is not a celebration of a war hero or a colonial hero, or, someone who hit bingo, right? Like, this is a celebration of a Black woman who just exists. I don't know much about Sharifa. I'm sure she has a whole history behind her, and I'm sorry that I do not know it and cannot name it right now and bring it into this space. But the fact that it doesn't matter, like, I don't need to know. She deserves to have this monument. And I think for me, a lot of the works in this space, like you're saying, conjure kind of a collective memory around Black diasporic material, let's say material language or grammar around how the architecture, the scaffolding of some of our material works might look. And like you said, the tchotchkes, like my grandmother had similar pieces in her home. And I remember one, I think Christmas, I actually bought her a little wooden figure that was handmade by someone that then ended up on an altar in our house, our family house, right? And so what does it mean to then take that and expand it and create something like the satellite, which is not just extremely large, it is one of the pieces where you can actually walk through and under it. So it becomes kind of a portal or a gateway, or let's say like a guardian, a steward of a space. Yeah. And what does it mean when architecture or when monuments can do that, when they become a reference or an opening to discuss the ways in which Blackness communicates through and across time and space?
Yeah, I think one thing that was really interesting also, like from you, is how you talk about sort of the shame space, or this sort of abstraction or flattening of temporal time, flattening of temporalities, just to sort of like bring people in, and I think that I wonder how that could be translated outside of a visual practice and in like a critical writing practice. How can we, so like I'm in a PhD program right now, and it's like, how can we sort of push against or challenge this idea of citations, or like who is being cited, and like how is that sort of connected to the same erasure and violence that Black women have been subjugated, to. I guess I wanted to just ask you, like, how, when you wrote that, like, what if we viewed her sculpture as a blueprint for bridging spiritual practices across the diaspora and introduction to a new visual language? How can that sort of almost like fluid visual language be like, how have you sort of incorporated that into your writing, or how do you that sort of being able to be manifest in writing?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always start the piece with, is my dad going to be able to read this? Are my cousins going to be able to read this? My mom's not here, but am I making it for her? How is she in the space and in the rooms? In particular, when it comes to arts writing, right? Because like we both discussed, everyone's not comfortable coming into these spaces. A lot of people feel you need to come in with a certain level of knowledge or understanding, or being able to cite certain references to the works, or historicize a certain legacy or a certain style of artwork, right? So abstraction, for instance, like being able to know who are the top dogs when it comes to that work, and how does this person fit within that universe, right? And for me, I'm more interested in leveling that and inviting people in almost as if like I'm a vessel and they can come in and see through my eyes to experience the work. Because it's not that I don't think citation is important, or to be able to discuss a work in relationship to the constellation it exists in, like the spiral or the universe of which it works within. I still think it's very much important to talk about the ways that a work touches us, not just from the mental or the logical, but also in the physical and the body. Like, what resonance does it have? What happens to you when you look at this work? What is brought up? what's all the things that's happening underneath the layers of projection, right? Underneath the layers of needing to feel smart or needing to feel, like your degrees are worth it. Like what actually happens when you just embrace a work, or work touches you, or you come in contact with something. And what happens beyond just looking at the work? What happens when you're in this space and you're the only Black person in it?
Yeah.
Looking at Simone Leigh's work, right? What happens? And I think it's very important.
How do you cite embodied knowledge? How do you cite the
Yeah.
things, tangibles, or, the idea that like this work feels familiar because it's something that is inside of me and not something that I can necessarily draw from a textbook or some foundational text about the canon of abstraction. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
like how can we bring contemporary fine art back into reality and into real life. And I wonder, is that the sense that you got when you attended the conference? Because I feel like that sort of idea of the loophole of retreat,
Yeah, it's interesting because a conference already works within a certain scaffolding, right? Within a certain container. And, like, okay, we're starting at 9, we're ending at this time.
this is the
There's, yeah, like over here, we're going to be doing talks. Over here, we're doing a film screening and whatever. So, you have like a particular kind of architecture of how the thing will go. But I think what was the beauty of it is that they were calling in their community and communities that have allowed the works to exist and grow and transform. Like, for instance, you were talking about sonic protection at the Guggenheim and the soundscape that was created in collaboration with More Mother, right? And then More Mother and Black Quantum Futurism performed at the beginning of one of the conference days, I believe the second day, because I missed the first day. We don't have to get into that. But on the second day, they performed, right? And so it was this notion of closing a circuit to open up a new portal. There were these notions of people talking from a very academic space and doing the citations and, maintaining the grammar of Black critical studies and extending it beyond the limits people have imposed onto us. And then there are also people who are talking from a very embodied space, who are also contending with, do I need to cite? What does it look like? What does it look like to actually just call in the things that are in my spirit, that are in my soul, the things that I haven't shared, the grief, the mourning, the pain, and having those held in the same regard as being able to point to theory, right? And then there's other people, including myself, where I love theory, and I love being able to point and name a thing, but then how do you put that theory into praxis? How do you ingest that theory and have it be part of your lived experience, which then transformed into embodied knowledge, which you can pass down from generation to generation, right? And so I felt that with each day and how the programming continued was this sense of each person was kind of weaving another stitch into the ways of which Black women have been able to be marauders, to be fugitives, to be living in liminal, to be magical beings that have been able to create worlds out of nothing and to destroy worlds when we're together, to undo it actively in the being collectively. And that was really exciting. And so I guess to answer the question that I haven't answered yet, this notion of, we are creating the new language, we are creating new syllabi, we are creating new structures of architecture that allow us to both dismantle and build at the same time. And sometimes there's tension in that, right?
Yeah.
There's people, I think, and yeah, I would like to ask you this too, like, I felt like for me, a lot of these works were calling in historical reference and expanding forward, like honoring the past and women and the work that they've done, and being able to, like, let's say cast that, to use the language, right, to cast that into the present and to freeze it in the time, because that's what happens with ceramics, right? You mold it and then it's cast, it's frozen. But what does it look like when we're also looking at Black female subjectivity and thawing it from trauma, and instead of trying to dismantle or, let's say infiltrate, or these other methods, create something that's completely anew or part of a different lineage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that like Simone Leigh was so smart in how she sort of like structured the exhibition, because I think that a large part of the exhibition was that conference that I missed, but that conference, because that I think that's what separates it from just existing within this lineage of Venice Biennale as this international art fair with its roots in the colonial past. I think that outside of the objects that she put on view, outside of her transformation of the exterior of the pavilion, outside of like all of that, just bringing all of these scholars together from across the diaspora and the continent, and having in dialogue, having a wide interdisciplinary conference, because that's another thing about conferences. It's like you'll have a conference that is on the most, like, the smallest niche subject matter, and have all of these people come in, but to have a conference that the subject matter is just like dismantling whiteness and sort of this necessity, the sort of affirmation of the collectivity for survival, like, is really powerful. I think that without that, one could just sort of like easily understand just the objects, like if they wanted to, if they had no connection to sort of like Black culture, and like sort of they didn't have this embodied connection to the works on view, one could go in there and sort of without acknowledging the conference, just see this as, again, another recuperation of the past, and I think that even in even at even the Loophole of Retreat Guggenheim exhibition, there was also that conference. I think that was like the Loophole of Retreat.
That was the official. Yeah.
So I think it's just really smart that when she's in these like questionable contexts, like a white, blue chip museum, or an international art fair, that there's this still leaning on the collective for survival, and leaning on the collective to make dismantling something actually generative, because it's like, you can sort of transform the exterior of the pavilion to sort of echo, African, architecture, but they also did that in Paris. You know what I'm saying? Like how are we not only dismantling, but creating something anew, creating a different lens through which we can understand these objects? Like I think she was really smart in doing that, and I hope that like other people don't just look at her. I hope that other artists don't just look at her works and be like, oh, I'm inspired by just the objects, but are inspired by her entire process, the sort of bringing other people in to celebrate this. And I read somewhere that she brought like Spelman's down to help, like even that I feel like is so radical, So I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, absolutely. I mean, if you want to use the word monumental, since that's part of the work, right? It's like the fact that she has consistently been able to bring community with her, which fights the narrative of there can only be one.
Yeah.
That fights the narrative of only one Black person, or one Black woman, or one Black queer person, or insert whatever hyphen you want, insert that here, can be the one in these spaces. She gets the invitation, and then she kicks open the door.
Yeah.
Right? And does it in a way that's very subversive, but also in a way that Black women have been able to. That's how we've survived, right? Like, we do it through the ways that we move, the ways that we meet in private, the ways that we convene, the ways that we support each other, the ways that we also cite each other. That's a different type of citation, right? The ways that we call in these different academics, these different scholars, cultural makers, social practitioners, into the space to say, thank you for being, you allow me to continue, right? And to not just create it as a one-off, but to then say, well, how do we keep doing this as the budgets expand? How do we bring in more people to A, get paid, and B, how do we give more people accessibility to this, right? Like you had mentioned, Spelman students were there, and many of them actually got to introduce a lot of the keynote speakers, right? And so there's this notion of this is the new generation. And then you have Lorianne O'Grady who's there, who's asking the question of, am I keeping the doors closed that I intended to open, right? So this notion of, like, as we come into these positions of perceived power, as we come into a certain status or stature in our careers, how are we continually critiquing that positionality? And how do we continue to create paths and lanes and roads to bring more people in order to continue this liberatory project? Because this is a war, you know, not to be so extreme, but
No.
yeah, like this, they don't like us, okay? Like they continue to not like us, and they continue to come for us. And it's a spiritual war as much as it is a geographical war, an ecological war, and so forth. So what are the ways that we create spaces and opportunities to come up with strategy?
Yeah.
And the power is coming together, right? The power is being able to say, we're going to use this money to literally plot. It's really on seduce and scheme energy, minus the seduction.
Funny that you, like, you know, you say, like, once we have this like perceived power, what are we going to do with it? Because I feel like it would have been so easy for an artist in the position of Simone Leigh to just sort of, I'm the first Black
It's
woman.
me.
It's me. No,
It's me.
not just like that would have been more typical, because that sort of aligns with this idea of the heroic artist who has the eye, who has the know-how. But it's just like, no, like, actually, yes, I'm that, you know, I'm the one, but like also there are so many, like, I'm not the only one, and that is, I think that's important, and I think that that's how we sort of get away from, because I feel like we're in a moment, particularly in contemporary art, where people are really trying to sort of embrace the subaltern and like embrace artists that would have typically been pushed to the margins, because we're in an era of inclusivity and diversity and like all of these things. And so how do you do that and be and have an institution sort of, you know, bring you in on that objective without becoming then a token, you know? How do you do
absolutely.
without, you know, without feeling like empowered by the fact that you were the only one, you know? And I think that Simone Leigh in this exhibition and her work from 2019 through, you know, to one is a testament to that. You know, just because you're sort of being brung in during this moment of increasing interest of black artistic and cultural production does not mean you have to exist as a token. It does not mean that that isn't an opportunity to kick the gates down for the, you know, for other people to come in.
And I think it's like you're saying, and I don't want to generalize. I don't want to say that most other Black folks in that position would just take the money and run and say, like, I am the one of one. Like, it doesn't mean that that is what would have happened. But I do think it's important for us as a community and as communities, right? Because Blackness is not a monolith, to discuss the ways in which we are planning to change things in a more sustainable and generative way. And as artists, as scholars, as professors, as, you know, like as any type of maker. You could be a teacher, you could just be an auntie, or not just, you are an auntie. What are the ways in which you are inviting people to also participate in the changes or the glow up or in the reimagining of Blackness as it stands today? And that was one of the questions I also had, like coming out of the both the Loophole, also coming out of the Venice Biennale, was, okay, so this has happened. How do we continue to have this discourse? How do we continue to hold artists accountable? And is that something that artists need to be accountable to? You know, because that's one of the things that kind of it can be a chip on my shoulder is that, oh, we talk about the theory, we talk about all the ways that we want freedom, we talk about all the people who are doing it, we can cite it, we can literally roll it up in science and data and all these beautiful things, right? And then when it comes down to the practice of how we go out in the world every day and how we treat each other, how we pull other people up with us, it's not always the same. And so, yeah, I guess maybe that's something I'm continuing with within myself, and also want to offer, maybe it's a question to you, is how do you imagine this type of work or the offerings that Simone Leigh has presented continuing beyond her particular works?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that this isn't for my own sake, I hope this isn't the last Loophole of Retreat conference. I hope that that's something that, like an ongoing project, you know, tied to her artistic production. You know, I think I would have gained a lot from being in that space. And I think that a lot of Black people, I mean, I saw the Instagram post after, people were floored, moved. Like it felt like I feel like the captions felt like it was like a spiritual experience, you know, rather than a conference. You know, I think that's how I see the work continuing. Also, just like in my own like work and writing, I'm interested in sort of widening the canon to include more Black contemporary artists, and I think that that's why I'm going through the hell of a PhD, is because that a lot of times, like, you know, particularly Black contemporary artists, like, you can have a lot of exhibitions and do a lot of things, but like a lot of times, like, your work isn't cemented in the canon until it's like, you know, until it's sort of like being usurped by scholarship and you know, people writing about your work in like this very critical way. And you know, there's issues with that. You know, I'm not a proponent of that being that I'm not a proponent of like academia functioning in that way, but I will say, like, in my own writing, am I going to be like focusing on comparing Black artists' work with white artists? Am I going to be looping in other Black artists? Am I going to be like, you know, like who are the scholars that I'm looking towards? You know, those types of questions that I have. I think that is me trying to sort of continue the work and try to like create, try to write within the world that Simone Leigh and others have created. You know what I mean? Like this idea of Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, like where those archival absences exist, how can we as writers think through and imagine Blackness existing in those spaces, and how can it exist differently than it might exist in the violence of the archive? Yeah, I want to sort of throw that back at you. Like, how do you
I'll catch it.
how do you see the work continuing, this sort of collective Black survival work continuing in your own practice in writing?
I mean, in general, I tend to work in collaboration and tend to work in locality as well. So it's not just a notion of working with other Black folks, it's also working with the land of which we are activating. It's also thinking about the spaces that we're in, and how do we collaborate with those spaces, and how can the work be made in stillness and sitting with something as opposed to imposing a need or a view. How, like you brought up critical fabulation and the holes within the archive, how do we mend those holes, but also how do we explore different pockets of history? You know, like I'm very much interested in alternative ways of rendering someone whole and exploring them through, you know, a tree that witnessed them grow up, right? Or through a natal chart, or through the stories of a person that is no longer with us, but with each voice that comes into the room, they are brought in sonically, right? So I feel like a lot of the things that were offered in the Loophole of Retreat, and also Simone Leigh's work, and what draws me to it is because I am part of that legacy. Like, this is the work that I feel I've inherited. You know, this is the work that I feel called to do and compelled to do, because there's so many people I know that were not able to do this. And there's so many people, who won't be able to do this. I think we often forget. I think Mickey Blanco did a post today about the fact that there's so many people who have dreams that will never come true.
Yeah.
There are so many people who have hopes and wishes and desires to be in certain places, to feel certain type of love, to create certain things, and will not get the means to do them. And as someone who has the means to do a lot, why wouldn't I try to activate that for not just myself, but for my community, for my family, for people who are not yet here, in order for them to exist in a way where they can hopefully, nurture and foster their dreams. And that's really important to me. And I feel like outside of myself, this work that Simone is offering, that Ruha, that Rashida, that Sidia, that Tina Camp, like all, we can go down and name the list, like all of my goddesses that they've offered is this notion of like, you can also do this by having these conversations, by hosting dinners at your house, by, the cookout that you have on the insert holiday here or not. It's not something that just has to exist within an institution. It's something that we can do with our own means. And it doesn't have to be grandiose or monumental. It can also be mundane, and that's equally as beautiful and important. And so I do offer that back to people as like, what are the ways that with what you have, you're going after the things that you would like to bring into this world? And how are you supporting the other people around you, like wholeheartedly supporting them and manifesting their dreams too, in the ways that you can, because we don't want to overextend ourselves because then nothing gets done. But like, how are you at least honoring the fact that there are privileges that exist within us or that operate within us in order to even be on Instagram right now, to be on this live, to be witnessing each other right now? Like, what duty do we have? What responsibility do we have to continue the work forward?
Yeah, I remember when I saw the pavilion, I like called my mom afterwards because she like has this art papers and she's like read this review.
Yeah.
And so like she like knows Simone Leigh's work. She's like hype about it, and she's like, "Oh my gosh!" And I'm like showing her videos and stuff, and she's like, "Oh my goodness, this is a trip of a lifetime. Like you're gonna remember forever, And I know that the sort of subtext beneath that is like I when I was your age was not able to travel like this. Hold on to this moment, and I definitely did, and I feel like I can sense through your writing that you did as well.
Oh, absolutely. Like it's such a beautiful thing to write about art, Like I think it's a gift every time to witness it and then see it and then ingest it and be able to gift that back to people. And again, it's even more of a gift to be able to travel to then see work that you dreamt about, right? Or that you never thought you'd be able to see, and then really reckoning with, oh, I'm seeing this. Who are all the other people who haven't been able to? And by me doing that, I'm allowing them and bringing them with me. And it could be people who are living too. I have friends who are just like, oh, girl, enjoy Venice, send me photos. So it's this notion of, yeah, like who do you bring with you when you write? And in whatever capacity or whatever you do, who are you bringing with you and who are you honoring? Yes, I see that we are coming to an end of an hour. So if folks have questions, it's the time. We are ready. We're open.
Yeah,
Tell
please.
us them now.
Or even thoughts,
Yeah, thoughts, concerns. Now my customer service is coming through. My retail is coming through. I mean, it's just beautiful to see who has came to support us today too. I see friends, I see people that have supported me through a lot of times. And it feels great to see that they came into the space. TK, I see you. You might have something to say. I don't know. I'm not going to call girls out. That's not my job.
I'm just kidding. No pressure.
No pressure. We're not. You are the PhD though, so you will be asking the girls to answer some tough questions.
I'm speechless for once.
Oh, thank you.
What made you want to write about art? Sorry if it's been spoken about already. No, and you
Oh
can go.
no. So, I can tell you a little bit about my history. I'm from Seattle, Washington, the Pacific Northwest. I've always been a writer. I actually started in fashion journalism. I always loved art, but growing up in an area where I didn't see a lot of Black art or Black artists or Black curators, I just felt like, oh, I don't have the chops to discuss it really. And since I didn't get a degree in art history, I didn't feel like I had the wherewithal to be able to talk about it until I did a uh, Black arts writing residency called the Black Embodiment Studio at the University of Washington. And we were asking ourselves these questions like, as a Black writer who writes about Black art, what are the inherent things that need to exist in order for you to create work that's in community with the person making the artwork, right? Like how do you approach arts writing? How do you approach art? How do you approach Black art? What are the qualifiers that need to exist in order for you to um, bring your full self to the piece, which is, we talked about different types of citations. So how can you historicize yet also track your own embodied experience with the work or the subjects or the subjectivity of the work? And so, yeah, I started doing arts writing in 2017 and wrote a piece about a Sandra Perry work that was at the Seattle Art Museum, which was just like, it blew my mind.
What word?
Um,
Curious.
it, it was ecologies of inhability.
Yeah, I know that word.
Yeah. And I'm a sci-fi gal, so that really just sent me. And I've been a fan of her work for such a long time, their work for such a long time. So to see it in person and then to use, I'm very much interested in form and how you use form to render something complete. And so I really wanted to get into like stars and space and use that language in order to talk about the work. So that was my first taste, and then I just continued after it because I recognized my love for poetry, my love for film, my love for performance could all be brought into arts writing.
Nice. Um,
And what about you? I mean, I know we're running out of time, but I
yeah,
definitely want you to
and
say your thing as well.
I don't know. I always grew up a very like art. I love to like paint and draw. My mom, she's like a teacher, and she always had this thing over the summer, like you have to read 2 books and like write me a report. So like we wouldn't just be lounging around me and my sister. And I remember one summer I was like, well, like can I get a sketchbook instead? And she's like, if you fill it all up, then I would just be out there sketching and sketching. So I feel like I've always just been like drawn to the visual and like the practice of art making. When I started undergrad, I took an African American art course that was taught by a 7-year-old white dude from like Ohio, and I just felt like, and I mean, we were talking about like David Hammons and Betty Saar and like all of these like really canonical Black artists. And every day I'd be in the class and be like, I can do this. Like, it was like that very like young, like naive angst. And I was like, no, but wait, like I feel like I have an important lens and voice to talk about art. So like, if he can, like, and it's Black,
Yeah.
I can
You're
too.
like, I can, yeah.
And mind you, I'm like 18, don't know anything about anything, but just blind faith that I'm like, if he can, I can do it. And so I like majored in art history, and I started sort of like engaging art then. And then I like moved to Atlanta, and I did a fellowship with Sarah. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I like curated an exhibition about Black abstraction and sort of looked at how during the Black arts movement, Black artists working in abstraction were sort of marginalized by like the mainstream art world, but then also sort of like there was a sort of contention within um, Black artists to be creating abstract work, but be firmly cementing it that it is Black art. So I think I just sort of like carried that into my like current work. artists who like work with NFTs and AI. So Sandra Perry, she's chef's kiss, you know. And I just really like I really sort of like understand the digital space in the same way that I understood sort of like the abstract space in the 1950s. I think that there was a group of like white men like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko who sort of like took hold of that and narrativized it in the way that supported them in their practice and left out a lot of other people who were making really interesting work. And I think that like net art discourses and digital art and NFTs are starting to be sort of narrativized and historicized in that same way. And there are really interesting like Black visual artists who are like making digital work that's understanding Blackness and understanding the internet as a space that is like uniquely primed to represent Blackness in an expansive way. So it doesn't have to sort of be one note. You know, we can sort of understand Blackness and all of its nuances and complexities through the realm of the digital. Because if you think about it, like the digital or like digital media or like the internet, the web, cyberspace, whatever you want to call it, like it is an abstraction. Like it's code that equals a visual thing. And so Blackness also is an abstraction, you know? It's like we know what it is, but we can't quite describe it because it's so capacious, you know? And so I think that like there's a lot of overlap, and I think that there's also this idea that of the digital divide where like a lot of Black people don't have access to digital technology, so therefore don't engage them, when increasingly not the case. And Black people are like running culture online, and you can see it through memes, you can see it through a lot of things that surface online, I think. And I'm going off on a tangent, but like that's sort of like how I came into art writing, and sort of my interest in art broadly is widening our understanding of what like Black art is, widening our understanding of a Black aesthetic, widening our understanding of things that perhaps were traditionally narrativized as being non-Black or like not engaging with Blackness, but really like most things, you know, what is really not Black. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, we're like 3 minutes over time, but I really enjoyed this conversation, Mia. Like, I hope that we can at least have more conversations like this.
It's about to be at least right here. I mean, we are already one step away with TK. So now we can just go directly to the source. And I
That,
hear you. I know we're wrapping up, but at least maybe we can tell the people where to find us and some things that are coming up. And yeah, I hope and wish well for your PhD journey, because
yeah.
it, that's definitely not an easy thing or a feat to take up, especially right now. And yeah, for myself, I hear you, and the digital being another space where Blackness can extend beyond the tethering to systems that have oppressed us. And that's why I also call in dreams and the dreamscape so much, because that's another space where we all have access to it for free at night every day. So I am working on a documentary with two lovely souls, Lori and Salix, and it's about dream technology and emerging technology that allows us to tap into our dreams at night, as well as charting the radical rest or rest as resistance movement in the ways that Black femmes and queer people have been able to look at the need for rest as a mode that needs to be centered as opposed to productivity in a capitalist society.
Wow, I love that. Like, when is it coming out? I guess I can
You know, we
ask you
you
when
can
it.
just we that's right here. We could do another live. People can find out more about all of that.
Yeah.
But yes, there's a lot of similarities in the ways to take from, or not to take, to expand beyond what Simone Leigh has offered us. What are the different sites outside of material making that allow Blackness to just soar and expand and be monumentous, right? So, yeah.
Oh, well, that seems like a good stopping point.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Sarah, for
Thank you,
making it
Sarah.
happen. Yeah, you guys have a good one.
Yeah, everyone enjoy.